If you are enjoying this video, smash that like button, subscribe, and hit the bell. Share it with your friends, and let me know in the comments where you are watching from. Every like and subscribe helps the channel grow. My name is Marcus Blackwood, and this happened to me back in 1962 when I was a forest ranger at Shoshone National Forest in Wyoming. I guess I should finally tell this story. I've kept it bottled up for too long. I was 45 then, fresh out of Korea where I'd served as a Marine, trying to find peace in the quiet of the forest. The nightmares from the war still haunted me, but something far worse was waiting in those woods. It was early December, and I was manning one of the most remote outposts near the Wind River Range. The locals, especially the Native Americans, had been warning us about something they called the long winter walker. I just smiled politely then. I wish I had listened. The trouble started when the weather went crazy. I mean, Wyoming winters are always harsh, but this was different. The temperature dropped to -40°F in just a few hours, something I'd never seen before in my 15 years as a ranger. But that wasn't the strangest part. We started seeing deer running through the forest in large groups, which made no sense because they should have migrated months ago. I lived in the ranger station with my dog Shadow, a loyal German shepherd who'd been with me since Korea. He was the only one who understood my silent battles with the war memories. That station, usually my safe haven, would soon become the front row seat to a horror I couldn't have imagined in my worst nightmares. Looking back now, I should have noticed the signs sooner. The radio started acting up, cutting out at random times. The local wildlife, the ones that hadn't fled, were acting strange, like they knew something we didn't. And those eyes, those blue-white eyes, watching from the tree line at dusk. I had no idea then that I was about to face something that would make my war experiences look like a walk in the park, something ancient, something hungry. Something that had made these forests its hunting ground long before any of us arrived. Should I go on and tell you what happened next? I have to warn you, this isn't a story with a happy ending. But it's a story that needs to be told, especially since 3 hikers had just gone missing in those woods. It all started getting really weird on the 5th of December. I was doing my evening rounds when Shadow started acting strange. He kept growling at the trees, his fur standing up like he'd seen something that scared him bad. Shadow was no ordinary dog. He'd faced gunfire in Korea without flinching, so seeing him scared, well, that got to me. I found the first dead deer that night. Now, I'd seen plenty of animal kills before, but this was different. The cuts were too clean, too precise, like someone had used surgical tools. Half the deer was just gone. The strange part? There was no blood in the snow. None at all. The next morning, I tried calling the main station about the 3 missing hikers. The radio was working fine 1 minute, then nothing but static the next. That's when I saw the tracks in the fresh snow. They looked human, sort of, but huge, about 18 inches long, and they just appeared out of nowhere, like whatever made them had dropped from the sky. Things got worse that evening. The temperature dropped so fast the windows of my cabin cracked. Then I heard it, someone calling for help, sounding exactly like Jimmy, our local guide. But Jimmy was supposed to be in town, 50 miles away. "Help! Marcus, I'm hurt!" the voice called again. Shadow wouldn't stop barking, pulling at his leash, trying to keep me from going outside. I've learned over the years that when animals act like that, you'd better listen. So I stayed put, watching through the window as the snow swirled in strange patterns, like it was dancing. That's when I saw them, those eyes, blue-white, like frozen stars watching from between the trees. They were at least 8 feet off the ground. No animal I knew stood that tall. The worst part? They were blinking. I grabbed my rifle and flashlight, but every time I shined the light where I saw those eyes, there was nothing there, just swirling snow and darkness. But I could feel it, watching me, studying me, like a kid looking at ants before deciding which one to squash. The next morning, I found more dead animals, And worse, much worse. I found Tommy's backpack. Tommy was one of the missing hikers. The backpack was frozen solid, covered in deep claw marks, and inside. Well, let's just say I knew then that Tommy wasn't coming back. I tried the radio again. Through the static, I caught bits and pieces of a weather report. A record-breaking blizzard was heading our way. But somehow, I knew this wasn't just any storm. Whatever was out there, it was bringing its own kind of winter. That night, as the wind howled outside my cabin, I pulled out the old books about local legends that the Native Americans had given me. I should have read them sooner. Because what I found in those pages about the wendigo, it matched everything I was seeing. And if those stories were true, we were all in serious trouble. The next morning, I got a radio call from the main office. They were sending a search party for the missing hikers. Steve Miller and his team of 4 were heading my way. I tried to warn them to stay away, but the radio cut out again. That afternoon, the snow started falling harder than I'd ever seen. But it was strange. It was only snowing around my area, like a circle of bad weather following me. I could actually see clear skies a few miles away. That's when I heard the screams. They came from the direction where Steve's team should have been. I grabbed my gear and Shadow and we headed out. The snow was so thick I could barely see 10 feet ahead. Then Shadow froze. His ears perked up. Through the howling wind, I heard something that made my blood run cold. It was Steve's voice, but it wasn't coming from the ground. It was coming from above us. I looked up, and there, about 20 feet high in a pine tree, were 2 of Steve's team members. They were frozen solid, just hanging there like Christmas ornaments. Their faces. I'll never forget their faces. They looked like they'd seen something so horrible that their last screams were frozen on their lips. That's when Shadow started barking like crazy. Through the swirling snow, I saw it for the first time. It was huge, at least 12 feet tall. Its antlers weren't like any deer's I'd ever seen. They looked sharp as razors. Its skin was a pale gray, stretched tight over bones, and those eyes. Those same blue-white eyes I'd seen before. The thing moved so fast it was like a blur. 1 second it was 100 yards away, the next it was right in front of us. Shadow, my brave Shadow, jumped between me and the creature. I raised my rifle, but before I could fire, the thing spoke. It spoke in Steve's voice, perfect and clear. "Marcus, help me!" I fired 3 shots, but the bullets seemed to go right through it, like shooting at smoke. The creature reached for Shadow, and I couldn't do anything. My loyal friend, my partner through war and peace, was gone in seconds. The monster lifted him up like he weighed nothing, and I can't even describe what happened next. I ran. For the first time since Korea, I ran in pure terror. Behind me, I heard it laughing in the voices of all the people it had taken. Steve, Tommy, the other hikers. All of them. I made it back to my cabin and locked myself in. But I knew locks wouldn't stop this thing. I had to figure out what it was and how to fight it. The Native American books mentioned that wendigos were created by greed and hunger, that they were once human. But they also mentioned something else, something about the creature's weakness. As I sat there, listening to the wind and those horrible voices calling my name, I remembered something from my Marine days, something about extreme heat. And I still had that white phosphorus grenade from Korea. I spent that night planning. I knew I couldn't just hide. The creature would eventually get in, and I had to end this before more people died. The old Native American books mentioned that wendigos often kept their victims in cold, dark places. That's when I remembered the ancient ice cave up in the mountains. The next morning, I packed my gear, the white phosphorus grenade, my rifle, even though I knew bullets wouldn't work, matches, and a torch. I also took something else, a small pouch of sacred herbs and a piece of paper with symbols that I'd copied from the Native American books. I didn't really believe in this stuff, but after what I'd seen, I wasn't taking any chances. The hike to the cave was the longest 2 hours of my life. The creature was playing with me, I could tell. Sometimes I'd hear shadows bark from behind me, then Steve's voice from ahead, then a child's laughter from the trees. But I kept going. When I reached the cave, what I found inside, God help me. Bodies, dozens of them, all perfectly preserved in ice, like a horrible museum. Some looked decades old. I recognized Tommy and the other hikers, still fresh, their faces frozen in terror. This thing had been hunting here for years, maybe centuries. That's when the temperature dropped even more, and I heard it enter the cave. It was different now, not trying to hide anymore. Its antlers scraped the cave ceiling, sending down showers of ice. Those blue-white eyes seemed to glow in the darkness. "Marcus," it hissed, using my own voice this time. "So hungry, always so hungry." I threw the torch at it first. Just like the book said, it didn't like fire. The creature shrieked and backed away. That's when I saw my chance. I pulled out the paper with the symbols and started reading the words I'd memorized. The wendigo screamed louder, but it wasn't enough. It came at me fast, its claws missing my face by inches. I rolled to the side, pulling the pin from the grenade. The creature reached for me again, and that's when I threw it, right into its open mouth. What happened next? The explosion filled the cave with burning white light. The wendigo's screams changed from angry to painful. The heat was so intense it started melting the ice walls. The creature thrashed around, its body burning with a fire that wouldn't go out. I ran for the cave entrance as the ceiling started collapsing. Behind me, I heard one final scream, this time in a voice that didn't sound human at all. Then everything went quiet, except for the sound of falling ice and rock. I made it out just as the cave collapsed completely. The blizzard stopped almost immediately, like someone had turned off a switch. For the first time in days, I could see the clear winter sky above me. I stood there for a long time, just breathing, watching the last bits of white smoke rise from the cave entrance. The silence was different now. It was just normal forest quiet. Not that horrible waiting kind of silence from before. The rescue team found me the next day. I told them about finding the missing hikers in the cave, about the avalanche that buried everything. What else could I say? Who would believe the real story? They did find some things, though. The cave-in had pushed up some old bones, really old bones, they said, and mixed in with them were pieces of antlers that no one could explain. The scientists argued about them for years. They'd never seen anything like them before. I left the ranger service after that winter. Couldn't stay there anymore. Every time it snows, I still check the footprints outside my door. And sometimes, on really cold nights, when the wind blows just right, I think I hear voices calling. You might be wondering why I'm telling this story now, after all these years. Well, last week I got a letter from a ranger station in Montana. They're having strange weather up there. Animals acting weird, people going missing, and there are tracks in the snow, 18 inches long. I wrote back right away with a warning. You see, the Native Americans told me something else. Wendigos are like seeds in the wind. Where one dies, another can grow. And they're patient. So patient. So if you're ever in the deep woods in winter, and the snow starts falling too hard and too fast, and you hear a voice you know calling from somewhere it shouldn't be, don't answer, don't look up. Just run as fast as you can. Because sometimes, the forest really does have teeth. My name is Victoria Hayes, and what I'm about to tell you happened to me back in 1977 when I was working as a ranger at Monongahela National Forest in West Virginia. I was 38 then, and before becoming a ranger, I had been an Olympic biathlete, which means I was pretty good at skiing and shooting. Little did I know these skills would help me survive the most terrifying experience of my life. It was autumn, and the forest was painted in beautiful shades of red and orange. As a ranger, I'd seen all kinds of strange things in these woods, but nothing could have prepared me for what was coming. The hunting season had just begun, and there was this eerie blood moon hanging in the sky every night, making everything look a bit spooky. I remember how the locals used to tell stories about the tall ones, creatures that walked on two legs but weren't human. I always thought these were just silly tales to scare kids and tourists. You know, every small town has its monsters, right? But then, strange things started happening. Farmers began reporting their animals being killed in weird ways, and the wolves in the area, well, they started acting really strange, almost like they were scared of something bigger and meaner than them. At first, I tried to stay practical about it all. That's how I am. I like facts, not fairy tales. But sometimes, the truth is scarier than any story, and what happened in those woods changed everything I thought I knew about what's real and what's not. Looking back now, I wish I had paid more attention to those early warning signs. Maybe things would have turned out differently. But I guess you never really expect to find yourself face to face with something that shouldn't exist. And trust me, what I saw in those woods definitely shouldn't have existed. It all started one cold October morning when I got a call about some dead wolves near the Eastern Trail. As a ranger, finding dead animals wasn't unusual, but what I saw that day still gives me nightmares. The wolves, there were 5 of them, looked like they had been carefully laid out in a circle. But the weird part? Their spines were missing, and there wasn't any blood around. In all my years as a ranger, I'd never seen anything like it. The next day, while checking the area, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. There were huge claw marks on the trees, way higher than a bear could reach, about 8 feet up. They were deep too, like whatever made them was incredibly strong. I took photos and measurements, but none of the wildlife experts I contacted could explain what kind of animal could do this. Then the hunters started bringing in their trail cameras, showing me pictures that made no sense. In some photos, there were these tall, dark shadows moving between trees. They looked almost human-shaped, but wrong. Too tall, too lean, and in some pictures, there were these red dots that looked like eyes reflecting the camera flash. But the scariest thing was the sounds at night. I live in a small cabin near the ranger station, and I started hearing these howls. Now, I know what wolves sound like. I've heard them hundreds of times. But these were different. They sounded like a mix between a wolf's howl and, well, like someone laughing. The kind of laugh that makes you want to hide under your blanket. Things got even stranger when I found deer carcasses in the forest. They weren't just randomly scattered like normal predator kills. No, they were arranged in perfect triangles or circles, like some sick kind of artwork. And every time I found one of these sites, I'd get this overwhelming feeling of being watched. I tried telling my superiors about what was happening, but they just blamed it on regular predators or poachers. But I knew better. Something was out there. Something smart enough to arrange its kills. Something tall enough to mark trees 8 feet up. And something that could take down entire wolf packs without leaving a trace of blood. Little did I know, these were just the warning signs of something much, much worse to come. The real horror hadn't even started yet, and those woods were about to become a hunting ground, not for the animals or the hunters, but for something else entirely. The first time I actually saw one of them, I was doing my evening patrol. The sun was setting, and I was about to head back to my cabin when I heard twigs snapping behind me. Not like when a deer walks by. These were heavy footsteps. I turned around slowly, and there it was. I'll never forget what I saw. Standing between 2 large oak trees was this creature. It must have been 7 feet tall, with a body covered in dark fur. But what really got me were its eyes. Bright red, like burning coals. And the way it stood, perfectly upright on 2 legs, just like a person. But this was no person. Its face was like a wolf's, but longer, more twisted, with teeth that showed even with its mouth closed. The scariest part? It wasn't alone. I could see more pairs of red eyes glowing in the darkness behind it. They were moving in a pattern, just like wolves do when they hunt. But these things were smarter. I watched as one of them picked up a broken branch and actually used it to poke at something on the ground. They were using tools, just like humans do. I stood completely still, remembering everything I knew about wolf behavior from my years in the forest. Then something even more terrifying happened. The first creature looked straight into my eyes. In that moment, I felt my whole body freeze up. I couldn't move, couldn't think. It was like its eyes were holding me in place. I only broke free when a distant car horn snapped me out of it. That night, back in my cabin, I started feeling strange, jumpy, paranoid. Every shadow seemed to move. Every sound made me flinch. Later, I learned that these creatures leave behind some kind of chemical in the air, like a scent that messes with your head. It makes you scared, confused, and easy to hunt. The next morning, I found weird markings all around my cabin, scratches on trees, weird symbols drawn in the dirt. They were sending me a message. They knew where I lived. I tried to take pictures, but my hands were shaking so bad. Most of them came out blurry. I thought about reporting what I'd seen, but who would believe me? A pack of 7-foot-tall wolf creatures that walk like humans and use tools? They'd think I was crazy. But I knew what I saw was real, and I knew I had to do something. Because if these things were as smart as they seemed, and as dangerous as I feared, then everyone in and around the forest was in serious danger. I just didn't know then how right I was, or how many people would die before I figured out how to stop them. That's when the death started. The first one was a hunter named Mike Thompson. They found him. I'm sorry, but it was horrible. He was hanging from a tree, and these creatures had taken his skin. I had to identify the body since I was the ranger on duty. The way they'd done it was so precise, almost surgical. This wasn't just an animal attack. These things knew exactly what they were doing. A week later, it got worse. 3 teenagers who were camping near Blue Creek, they never made it home. When we found their campsite, it looked like a war zone. Their tent was ripped to shreds, and their bodies, they were in pieces. The weird thing was, their flashlights were arranged in a perfect triangle, pointing at where we found them. These creatures weren't just killing, they were sending messages. Then we lost Jim, one of our maintenance workers. Poor Jim was just fixing a broken trail sign. They only found his hard hat and his head was placed on top of his truck. The rest of him was never found. I remember standing there, looking at his truck, seeing those same claw marks I'd noticed on the trees. The state police finally got involved after that. They sent 2 troopers, Cooper and Martinez, to patrol the forest at night. Big mistake. We found their patrol car the next morning, torn apart like it was made of paper. Both officers were inside, but I won't describe what was left of them. The strange thing was, their guns hadn't been fired, like they never even had a chance to react. But the worst was the Miller family. The Millers had a farm right at the edge of the forest. One morning, their neighbors called because the cows hadn't been milked, very unusual for Frank Miller. When I got there with the police, I still have nightmares about it. The whole family, Frank, his wife Sarah, and their 2 kids, they were posed like dolls around their dinner table. Like some sick game. I knew I had to do something. These deaths weren't random. The creatures were getting bolder, smarter, and more cruel with each attack. They were playing with us, showing us they could take anyone, anytime. But why? What did they want? That's when I remembered something from my early ranger training about an old coal mine in the forest that the local Native Americans used to call the Spirit Cave. According to their stories, it was a sacred place, a burial ground that should never be disturbed. I had a horrible feeling that these creatures and that mine were connected, and I knew that if I wanted to stop these killings, I'd have to go down there, even though everything inside me was screaming not to. I waited until sunrise, gathered my gear, my rifle, flashlights, and a map of the old mine system. I'd spent years tracking wolves, and I knew these creatures, despite their intelligence, still followed pack behavior. Like wolves, they'd have a den, a place to rest and hide. The mine entrance was hidden behind thick bushes. The moment I stepped inside, the air changed. It became heavy and cold. The beam of my flashlight showed old mining tracks disappearing into the darkness. And there was this smell, like wet fur mixed with something rotting. As I went deeper, I started finding things, torn pieces of clothing from the victims, collected and piled neatly in corners. There were strange marks on the walls, too. Not just claw marks, but symbols I'd never seen before. Some looked ancient, others seemed fresh. Then I heard it, that horrible laughing howl echoing through the tunnels. But this time, it was coming from all around me. They knew I was here. I kept moving, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it. The tunnel opened into a larger cave, and what I saw there made me freeze. The cave walls were covered with hundreds of bones, not just animal bones, but human too. They were arranged in patterns, spiraling out from a central point where there was some kind of stone altar. This wasn't just a den, it was some kind of sacred place. And scattered around were fresh bones. I recognized pieces of Jim's uniform and the Miller family's clothes. Suddenly, my flashlight caught movement. Red eyes appeared in every tunnel entrance. I was surrounded. The largest one, the leader I'd seen before, stepped into the light. But instead of attacking, it did something that chilled me to my bones. It spoke. Not in words, but in a series of growls and clicks that somehow I could understand. They were protecting this place, this burial ground. The killings weren't random. They were warnings to keep people away. When the mining company had started exploring the area again, they'd awakened something that should have stayed buried. I had seconds to make a decision. The creatures were closing in, and I remembered everything I knew about wolf packs, how they respect hierarchy, how they communicate through body language. I did the only thing I could think of. I slowly lowered my rifle, looked the leader straight in its eyes, and bowed my head, just like a submissive wolf would. What happened next would determine whether I lived or died in that dark cave, hundreds of feet below the forest floor. For what felt like forever, nobody moved. Then the leader made a sound, something between a growl and a sigh. It stepped forward, sniffed the air around me, and did something unexpected. It touched my forehead with its clawed hand. In that moment, images flooded my mind. Centuries of their kind protecting this sacred ground, the pain they felt when humans started digging into their home, their anger at the desecration of their ancestors' resting place. Suddenly, water started rushing into the cave. The old mine shafts were flooding, maybe from all the recent rains. The creatures howled in alarm, and chaos broke loose. I ran, splashing through the rising water, with the pack right behind me. But they weren't chasing me. They were running from the flood too. The tunnels were filling up fast. In the confusion, I took a wrong turn and ended up in a dead end. The water was already up to my chest. Just when I thought it was over, I felt something grab my jacket. It was the leader. It pulled me toward a different tunnel, one I hadn't seen before. The other creatures were already climbing up through it. I followed them, crawling through spaces so tight I could barely breathe. The water was right behind us, and I could hear the tunnels collapsing. Finally, we burst out of a hole near the top of a hill, a secret entrance I'd never known existed. Standing there in the moonlight, soaking wet and gasping for air, I watched as the creatures gathered on a ridge. The leader turned to me one last time, those red eyes now somehow less terrifying. It made a gesture, touching its chest and then pointing to the ground. I understood. This was their home, their sacred duty. All they wanted was to protect it. The next day, I filed a report about unsafe old mine shafts and dangerous sinkholes. The mining company's new exploration permits were denied. The killings stopped. Sometimes, on full moon nights, I still hear those howls in the distance. But they don't sound like laughter anymore. More like a warning, a reminder. I left Monongahela National Forest a year later. But before I did, I made sure all the maps of that area were marked as unstable ground, too dangerous for hiking or camping. Some places should be left alone, some secrets should stay buried, and some guardians, no matter how terrifying, deserve our respect. Even now, years later, when people ask me about my time as a ranger, I tell them the forest holds mysteries we can't understand. And if they're ever hiking in West Virginia and hear something that sounds like a wolf's laugh, they should turn around and walk away. because some creatures walk on two legs, and they've been protecting their land a lot longer than we've been trying to claim it. That's my story. You might not believe it, but every word is true. I know, because I'm one of the few who met the guardians of Monongahela and lived to tell about it. My name is James O'Connor, and this happened to me in the summer of 1989. I was a 52-year-old forest ranger at White Mountain National Forest in New Hampshire, and trust me, what I'm about to tell you still gives me nightmares. Before I get into the horror that changed my life forever, you should know a bit about me. I wasn't always the scared, cautious man I am today. Back then, I was just a lonely ranger who drank too much, trying to forget my wife Sarah, who passed away 3 years earlier. The forest was my escape, my home, and I thought I knew every tree, every trail, and every shadow in it. Boy, was I wrong. It all started when little Tommy Parker, age 8, went missing while hiking with his family. Usually, when kids get lost in these woods, we find them within a day or two, scared and hungry but alive. Not this time. Then came the Wilson family's disappearance, and after that, Old Man Jenkins' prized cattle were found. Well, let's just say what was left of them wasn't natural. The locals had always told stories about something they called the Hungry One, some ancient creature living in the mountain caves. I used to laugh at those tales, thinking they were just stories to scare kids away from wandering too deep into the forest. The elders would say, "When the lights dance in the mountain caves, the hungry one is looking for its next meal." I'm not laughing anymore. I remember sitting in my cabin one evening, nursing my usual whiskey, when Bill Thompson, another ranger, radioed in about strange lights coming from Cave System B. That call marked the beginning of what would become the most terrifying experience of my life. The first signs that something was terribly wrong started showing up everywhere. I noticed it during my morning patrols, things that just didn't make sense. The rich, dark soil where wildflowers usually grew turned gray and lifeless overnight. Nothing would grow there, not even weeds. It was as if the ground itself had died. Then came the trees. Oh God, the trees. I've been a ranger for 30 years, but I'd never seen anything like it. They weren't dying from the outside like normal trees do. They were rotting from the inside out. When we cut one open to check, the inside was black and mushy, like week-old banana. The smell. I'll never forget that smell. But what really scared me was the birds. One morning, I was walking down Trail 23 when they just started falling from the sky. Dozens of them, robins, blue jays, sparrows. When I picked one up, wearing gloves, thank goodness, it felt like a water balloon. Their insides had turned to liquid, but there wasn't a mark on them outside. The air changed too. It became thick and heavy, like breathing through a wet blanket. There were these tiny spores floating around, so many that they looked like dust in sunlight. Many folks in town started wearing masks, saying the air made them feel dizzy and gave them strange dreams. But the worst part? The fungus. We started finding these weird mushroom-like growths everywhere. They weren't like any mushrooms I'd ever seen. They were almost metallic-looking, with colors that shouldn't exist in nature. And I swear, they moved when you weren't looking directly at them. I set up a camera once, just to prove to myself I was imagining things. When I watched the footage later, I dropped my coffee mug and it shattered on the floor. The footage showed the fungus crawling across the ground like some kind of slug. I called in experts from the state university, but they were just as confused as we were. One of them, Dr. Sarah Chen, took some samples back to her lab. She called me the next day, her voice shaking. "James," she said, "this isn't like anything we've ever seen. The cellular structure. It's not normal." That's when I knew we were dealing with something far worse than just a strange forest disease, but I had no idea how bad it was about to get. It was on a cold Tuesday night when we first saw what we were really dealing with. I was patrolling with Bill near Cave System B, following up on reports of strange noises. Our flashlights caught something moving in the darkness, something big. At first, we thought it was just a bear. But bears don't change shape. This thing, it was like watching a giant blob of pizza dough that could move and think. It was mostly white and gray, like a massive fungus, but it could stretch, split, and reform itself. The worst part? It looked alive. Really alive. Smart alive. "Jim," Bill whispered, his voice shaking, "we need to get out of here, now." But before we could move, the thing split itself into 3 smaller parts. They moved like they were hunting, spreading out to surround us. The air filled with those spores again, and I started seeing things that couldn't be real. The trees seemed to breathe. The ground looked like it was moving. Bill started laughing for no reason. Those spores were messing with our heads. We ran. God, we ran so fast. But one of those things caught up with a deer that was nearby. I'll never forget what happened next. The creature just wrapped around the deer, and within seconds, the poor animal just collapsed. Later, when we found its body, it was hollow inside, like something had dissolved everything except the skin and bones. The really scary part? We started finding evidence that this thing could control smaller animals. We found squirrels and rabbits behaving strangely, moving in unnatural ways. When we examined one, we found tiny fungal threads growing through their bodies, like puppet strings. I radioed for backup and called every expert I could think of, but deep down, I knew we were in way over our heads. This wasn't just some weird forest creature, this was something else entirely. Something that had been waiting in those caves, maybe for hundreds or thousands of years. And now it was hungry. The first family we lost was the Hendersons, Mom, Dad, and their 3 kids who were just camping for the weekend. When we found their campsite, I wished I hadn't. They were still standing there, like statues, but completely covered in that gray-white fungus. The rangers with me got sick just looking at it. I still have nightmares about their expressions, frozen in terror. Then we lost Mike and Steve, 2 of our best rangers. They went to check out some strange noises near the East Trail. We found their equipment 6 hours later, but their bodies, it was like they'd melted from the inside out. Just empty clothes and puddles of something I don't even want to describe. The search party we sent out, 12 good people from the town. They came back changed. They were walking funny, like robots, with that same fungus growing out of their ears and eyes. We had to lock them up in the visitor center. By morning, they were gone, leaving behind only traces of that cursed fungus. A tourist bus went missing next. When we found it 2 days later, it was like a horror show. All 23 people were still in their seats, but they were covered in spores, their bodies serving as food for that thing. The bus driver's dash camera caught something on tape, a massive shifting shape that just melted through the bus windows like they weren't even there. But the worst was what happened to Dr. Chen, the scientist who'd been studying the fungus. She'd gotten close to understanding what it was when, well, they found her in her lab. It looked like something had grown inside her and then burst out, like she was some kind of overripe fruit. Her last notes just said, "It's alive. It thinks. It learns." I knew we had to do something fast. People were starting to panic. The town was talking about calling in the military, but I had this horrible feeling that by the time they arrived, it would be too late. This thing was getting bigger, smarter, and hungrier with each passing day. It was Dr. Chen's last notes that finally helped me understand what we were dealing with. Before she died, she'd written about how this thing was like one giant brain made of fungus, a hive mind that had been sleeping in those caves for maybe thousands of years. Our modern logging and mining must have woken it up, and now it was hungry. But there was something else in her notes, something about how the fungus samples died when she accidentally left them in the lab's freezer. That's when it hit me. This thing couldn't handle extreme cold. I remembered the old botanical research facility at the edge of the forest. They had these huge industrial freezers used for preserving plant samples. If we could somehow lure this thing in there, time was running out. The fungus was spreading faster now, and a solar eclipse was coming up, the same conditions mentioned in all the old stories about the Hungry One. I gathered everyone I could trust who was still left, just 4 of us. We loaded up the freezers with generators and waited. The eclipse started, and that's when it came, bigger than ever, like a tidal wave of living fungus. The spores were so thick in the air, I could barely see. My friends, they got caught in it. I watched helplessly as the fungus took them, one by one. But they gave me enough time. I managed to lure it into the facility. By breaking open the chemical storage, it seemed attracted to the strong smells. When it followed me into the freezer room, I hit the emergency locks and cranked every freezer to maximum power. The generators whined, and the temperature dropped so fast the air itself seemed to crack. "The thing?" it screamed, not with a voice, but with something I felt in my head. It tried to escape, tried to break down the doors, but the cold was too much. I watched through the freezer windows as it slowly hardened and crumbled, like ice breaking apart. I stayed there for 6 hours, shivering, making sure it was really dead. When the rescue teams finally found me, I was nearly frozen myself, but I was alive. And more importantly, that thing was dead. They cleaned up the forest, burned everything that looked infected. The official story says it was a new type of fungal infection that got out of control. Maybe that's better than the truth. But sometimes, on cold nights when I'm alone in my cabin, I swear I can still hear something moving in those caves. And when I see mushrooms growing in my yard, I burn them, every single one. Because I know now, there are things in this world that sleep in dark places, ancient things that should never wake up. And sometimes, the stories the old folks tell aren't just stories after all. My name is Thomas Reeves, and what I'm about to tell you happened to me in the winter of 1995. I was 41 then, working as a park ranger at Olympic National Park in Washington. Before taking this job, I spent 15 years exploring caves. They call it spelunking, and I thought I'd seen everything there was to see underground. Boy, was I wrong. That year was different from the start. We had the worst rainfall anyone could remember. Not just the usual Pacific Northwest drizzle, but heavy, endless rain that seemed to drill into the earth itself. The old-timers in the local Native American tribes started getting nervous. I remember Martha, an elderly woman from the local tribe, grabbing my arm one day and telling me about those who dwell below. First, I did what most of us do, smiled politely and nodded. Now I wish I'd listened more carefully. It all began when the sinkholes started appearing. Not your regular sinkholes, mind you. These were perfectly round, like someone had used a giant cookie cutter on the forest floor. And the tremors, they weren't like normal earthquakes. They felt wrong somehow, more like pulses coming from deep underground, like heartbeats. I still remember my first morning on duty when things started getting strange. I was doing my usual rounds, checking the marked trails, when I noticed something odd about the Morrison Cave system, a popular spot for tourist groups. There was a new opening, right where I knew there shouldn't be one. I'd walked past that exact spot hundreds of times, but now there was a crack in the rock wall big enough to fit a car through. That was just the beginning. If I'd known what was coming next, I might have packed up and left right then. But I didn't. And what happened in those caves over the next few weeks still haunts my dreams. I decided to check out that new cave opening the next day. I'd been exploring caves long enough to know you never go alone. So I took along Mike, another ranger, and we carried all the usual gear: ropes, helmets, flashlights, the works. The moment we stepped inside, something felt off. You know how caves usually have that musty, earthy smell? This one smelled different, like something metallic, almost like blood. Our flashlight beams showed that the walls were weird. They were too smooth, like they'd been polished. And there were these marks on them, not regular cave drawings, but fresh-looking symbols that seemed to twist and change when you looked at them too long. "Tom," Mike whispered, "look at this." He was pointing his light at a small stream running along the cave floor. The water was black, not muddy or dirty, but pitch black like ink. When I touched it with my gloved hand, the glove started smoking. That's when we heard it. It was a sound I'll never forget. Like someone dragging heavy chains across stone, but also like singing. It came from deeper in the cave, and it made our skin crawl. Then our flashlights started flickering. "We need to get out of here," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. But as we turned around, we realized something terrible. The passage we'd come through looked different. New tunnels had appeared, branching off in all directions. It was like the cave itself had rearranged while we were inside. That's when our flashlights died completely. In the pitch darkness, we heard something moving. Not like a bat or a cave creature, this was big. And it wasn't just walking, it was climbing on the walls. The sound of scraping got closer and closer. Mike grabbed my arm. "Tom," he whispered, "something just brushed past my leg." I fumbled with my backup lighter, and when I finally got it lit, when I finally got the lighter working, I almost wished I hadn't. There, not 3 feet from us, was something I still can't fully explain. It looked human-like, but wrong. It was pale white, like something that had never seen the sun, and its skin seemed to shine in the lighter's flame. But its eyes, they were huge, completely black, and they didn't reflect any light at all. Mike screamed, "I wish he hadn't done that." The creature's head snapped toward him faster than anything I've ever seen move. Before I could even blink, it had grabbed Mike with hands that looked more like claws. I dropped the lighter in shock, and everything went dark again. The sounds that followed, I'll never forget them. I ran. I'm not proud of it, but I ran. I could hear Mike screaming behind me, but the sound was getting further away, like he was being dragged deeper into the cave. I kept hitting walls in the darkness, scraping my hands and face, but I didn't stop. Somehow, maybe by pure luck, I found my way out. When I burst out of the cave into the daylight, I immediately called for help on my radio. Within an hour, we had a search team at the entrance, but when we went back in, everything was different. The smooth walls were gone. The black water had vanished. It looked like a normal cave again. We searched for Mike for 3 days straight. All we found was his flashlight, crushed like it had been squeezed by a giant hand. But that was just the beginning. Over the next few weeks, more people started disappearing. First, it was a team of professional cave explorers who'd come to study the sinkholes. We found them 2 days later, but I can't even describe what happened to their eyes. Then, 2 geologists went missing while taking rock samples. When we found them, it looked like something had turned them inside out. The local news sent a camera crew to cover the story. They went into one of the caves to film, and we watched in horror as the footage showed them literally being pulled into the solid rock walls. Their screams still echo in my nightmares. By this point, the park was closed to visitors, but the creatures, whatever they were, seemed to be getting bolder. The sinkholes were appearing closer to town, and the tremors were getting stronger every day. I couldn't sleep at night, knowing what was out there, knowing what had happened to Mike and the others. That's when Martha, the elderly tribal woman, came to me again. This time, I was ready to listen. She told me about an ancient city deep underground, built by beings who lived there long before humans walked the earth. According to her people's stories, these creatures were guardians of something, a doorway to somewhere else, somewhere that should never be opened. I knew I had to go back down there, not because I was brave. I was terrified, but because I was the only one who had seen these things and made it back alive. This time, I prepared differently. Martha taught me about the cave's natural acoustics, how certain sounds could hurt these creatures. I took speakers, amplifiers, and specific recordings she helped me make. I waited for a rainy night, not hard to find that year, and went in alone. The cave entrance seemed to breathe, letting out cold air like decay. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely hold my flashlight, but I had to keep going. As I went deeper, I started seeing signs of their civilization. The walls weren't just smooth anymore. They had patterns, like a city's streets and buildings, but all wrong somehow. Like they were built for beings that could climb on walls and ceilings, The black water was everywhere now, flowing upwards against gravity. Then, I saw it. The ancient city Martha had talked about. It was huge, stretching as far as my light could reach, with buildings made of some black stone that seemed to eat light. And there were hundreds of them down there, moving around like spiders, climbing everything. But what they were protecting, that was worse. In the center of their city was a hole in reality itself. It looked like a tear in the air, showing things that hurt my eyes just to look at. And they were trying to make it bigger. They spotted me before I could fully process what I was seeing. Their heads all turned at once, those black eyes fixed on me. The silence was deafening. Then they started moving towards me, climbing over each other like a wave of pale limbs and claws. My hands were trembling as I reached for the play button on my speaker system. The recording Martha had helped me make was a mix of specific tones and ancient chants. As soon as I played it, the effect was instant. The creatures stopped, their bodies twisting in what looked like pain. The sound echoed through the cave, getting louder as it bounced off the walls. But I hadn't counted on one thing. The vibrations from the speakers caused the already unstable cave to start crumbling. Water began pouring in from everywhere, not just the black water, but the rainwater from above. The creatures screamed, a sound that made my blood freeze, and started scrambling away from the water. That's when I realized they were afraid of regular water. It hurt them like acid. The rain from above had been weakening their tunnels all this time. In the chaos, I saw their portal starting to flutter and shrink. The creatures were trying to escape through it, but the water was coming down too fast. I ran, stumbling through the flooded passages, the sounds of collapsing rock and inhuman shrieks following me. I don't really remember how I made it out. Everything was a blur of running, swimming, and crawling through gaps in the rock. When I finally reached the surface, the ground was still shaking. Several new sinkholes had opened up, but these were filling with rainwater, sending torrents down into the caves below. For 3 days straight, the rain poured harder than ever. When it finally stopped, the sinkholes had all filled up, creating new lakes in the park. The tremors never came back. Whatever was down there, whatever they were trying to do, the water sealed it all away. The official story was that it was all just a series of natural cave-ins caused by the heavy rains. Maybe that's better. Who would believe the truth anyway? I still work at the park, but I never go near caves anymore. Sometimes, on really quiet nights, I think I can hear something coming from those new lakes, like singing, but not quite. And when it rains really hard, I don't sleep. I just sit by my window, watching the water come down, grateful that it's keeping those things where they belong, deep in the dark, far below our feet. My name is Catherine Wolfe, and what I'm about to tell you happened to me in the summer of 1971. I was 35 then, working as a park ranger at Badlands National Park in South Dakota. Before this job, I used to be an anthropologist, studying ancient cultures and their traditions. I thought that background would help me understand the land better. I had no idea how right and wrong I would be. That summer was unlike anything we'd seen before. The heat was unbearable, turning the already dry Badlands into a cracking, dusty wasteland. The ground was so parched it looked like an old piece of leather left in the sun too long. But the drought wasn't what worried me most. It started with warnings from the local Lakota elders. I remember old Joseph Running Bear, his weathered face serious as he told me about the Earth Taker, an ancient spirit their people had known about for generations. At first, I did what most people would do. I smiled politely and filed it away as an interesting piece of local folklore. How I wish I had listened more carefully. Then the archaeological team arrived. They were excited about some new dig sites they'd discovered, places where the drought had exposed old burial grounds. I remember thinking something felt wrong about disturbing those sites, but who was I to question scientists? The ground itself seemed to tremble sometimes, small shakes that our equipment couldn't quite explain. Little did I know that these were just the first signs of something ancient waking up, something that had been sleeping in these red earth badlands for centuries. and it wasn't happy about being disturbed. It started with small things that were easy to brush off. One morning, I found a strange circle in the dirt near my ranger station. It looked like something had swirled the sand around, but there hadn't been any wind that night. When I tried to take a picture, my camera just wouldn't focus right. Then came the reports from visitors about their dogs acting weird. They wouldn't walk on certain parts of the trail, just stood there whining and pulling back on their leashes. A week later, a hiker told me he saw the ground swallow a rabbit hole. I thought he was just seeing things in the heat, but deep down, something felt off. The archaeological team started having troubles too. Every morning they'd find their careful excavation work messed up, not by people or animals, but as if the earth itself had shifted overnight. Tools would go missing, only to be found buried deep in the ground days later, sometimes miles from where they were left. One evening, as I was doing my final rounds, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A rock formation that definitely wasn't there the day before had appeared. Tall, twisted spires of red stone that looked almost like fingers reaching up from the ground. When I touched them, they felt warm, like they had a pulse. But the scariest part was the sounds. At night, if you stood really still, you could hear something like breathing coming from deep underground. Not wind. I know what wind in caves sounds like. This was different. It was rhythmic, slow, and somehow alive. The local Lakota people started leaving offerings at the park entrance, small bundles of sage, tobacco, and sweet grass. To keep the earth taker calm, they said. I started carrying some sage in my pocket too, just in case. Then we found the first chamber. A huge crack had opened up after a small tremor, revealing a perfectly round room carved into the rock. The walls were covered in handprints that seemed to glow in the dark. When our geologist tried to take samples, her chisel crumbled to dust. That's when I knew we weren't dealing with normal ground anymore. People started whispering about moving shadows in the canyons, about the earth feeling hungry under their feet. I'd worked in these badlands for years, but for the first time, I felt like the land was watching us, watching and waiting. The first time I saw it, I thought I was going crazy. I was doing my evening patrol near one of the dig sites when the ground started to shake. Not like a normal earthquake, this felt more like giant footsteps. Then, right in front of me, the red earth began to move and rise up. It was like watching a mountain come alive. The creature was massive, made entirely of rock and dirt, but it moved as smoothly as water. Its body looked like the twisted spires I'd seen before, but now I could see they really were fingers. Huge fingers attached to hands made of stone. Where its face should have been, there were just deep, dark holes that glowed with an ancient, angry light. I couldn't move. I couldn't even breathe. The radio on my belt crackled with static, and my flashlight flickered and died. The air smelled like wet clay and something older, something that reminded me of ancient burial grounds. The creature didn't walk, it flowed across the ground, leaving trails of quicksand in its wake. When it moved past rocks, they seemed to come alive too, rolling and shifting like they were being pulled by invisible strings. I watched in horror as it approached the archaeological camp. Dr. Martinez, one of the archaeologists, was still working late. He didn't even have time to scream. The creature's touch turned the ground under his feet into liquid sand, and before anyone could help, he started sinking. I ran toward him, but the ground wouldn't let me get close. It kept shifting and moving under my feet. That's when I remembered what Joseph Running Bear had told me about the Earth Taker. It wasn't just a spirit, it was a guardian, protecting the sacred lands from those who would disturb them. And now it was awake, angry, and hungry. The worst part was how it could control the earth itself. Anywhere it went, the ground became its weapon. It could create sinkholes in seconds, turn solid rock into quicksand, or make the earth rise up like waves in the ocean. And when it caught someone, well, I soon learned why the Lakota had been so afraid of it. I radioed for help, but who would believe me? How could I explain that the earth itself had come alive and was hunting us? All I knew was that I had to find a way to stop it, or the Badlands would become a real-life burial ground for everyone in the park. The next few days were like a nightmare that wouldn't end. I tried warning people, but how do you tell someone that the ground beneath their feet might eat them alive? The first group we lost was the rest of the archaeological team. I'll never forget the sound of their screams. They were documenting some newly found artifacts when the creature appeared. In seconds, their skin started turning gray and rough, like sandstone. They didn't die, it was worse. They became part of the rock face, their faces frozen in terror. Sometimes, when I walk past that spot, I swear I can still see their expressions in the canyon wall. Then came the Anderson family, tourists from Minnesota. They were just taking pictures near Fossil Trail when the ground opened up beneath them. The parents managed to run, but their camera was left behind, half buried in the dirt. When we developed the film later, the last photo showed a massive shape rising from the earth behind them. Tom Whitebull, our best local guide, was next. He knew these lands better than anyone, but even he couldn't fight living rock. We found his hat near a pile of freshly formed boulders. The rocks were arranged in the shape of a person, and they were warm to the touch. A research team from the university came to investigate the disappearances. They set up their equipment, talking about seismic activity and geological anomalies. That night, the creature turned them all into perfect stone statues. They're still there, their scientific instruments clutched in their now rocky hands. The park was closed after that, but it didn't help. The creature was getting stronger, feeding off the fear and death. Each person it took seemed to make it bigger, more powerful. The red earth of the Badlands was turning into its own living thing, hungry for more victims. I started having nightmares about the ground opening up under my feet. Every step I took felt dangerous. The Earth Taker was playing with us, like a cat with mice, and we were running out of places to hide. I knew I had to do something. I couldn't watch more people die. That's when I remembered Joseph Running Bear's stories. Maybe the old ways were the only way to fight something this ancient. I found Joseph at his home on the reservation. His eyes were sad when he saw me. "You've seen it, haven't you?" he asked. "The Earth Taker is angry because we forgot to respect the land. He taught me an old Lakota ritual, a way to speak to the earth itself. It wasn't magic," he said, "just the oldest form of listening." That night, during a full moon, I went back to the sacred burial ground. The air felt heavy, like right before a storm. I carried the bundle of sage and sweet grass Joseph had given me, my hands shaking as I lit them. The ground started trembling before I even finished the first prayer. The Earth Taker rose up, bigger than ever, its stone body blocking out the moonlight. But this time, I stood my ground. I kept chanting the words Joseph taught me, even as the rocks around me came alive. A massive sandstorm appeared out of nowhere. I could barely see, but I kept going. The creature roared, a sound like mountains breaking apart. It tried to turn the ground to quicksand under me, but the sacred herbs seemed to create a safe circle. Then, something amazing happened. As I spoke the final words of the ritual, other voices joined in. Ancient voices, coming from the earth itself. The stone figures of the people the creature had taken started glowing. They weren't just statues, they were witnesses, and now they were helping me. The Earth Taker started shrinking, not in size, but in anger. The glowing holes of its eyes changed from red to a softer earthen brown. I realized then what Joseph meant. It wasn't about fighting the creature, but understanding it. It was a guardian, not a monster. We were the ones who had forgotten to respect what it protected. Slowly, the sandstorm died down. The creature sank back into the earth, but not before I saw it nod, just slightly. A sign of understanding, maybe even forgiveness. The ground settled, and for the first time in weeks, the Badlands felt peaceful again. The park reopened eventually, but things were different now. The archaeological digs were stopped. Sacred sites were marked and protected. And if you visit today, you might notice small bundles of sage and sweetgrass left at trailheads, offerings of respect to the ancient guardian that still watches over this red earth. Sometimes, on quiet nights, I still hear that deep, earthen breathing, but it doesn't scare me anymore. It reminds me that some places deserve our respect, and some stories need to be remembered, not as legends, but as warnings. That's my story. Whether you believe it or not, just remember. The next time you're walking on ancient ground, step carefully and listen closely. The earth remembers, and sometimes, it answers back.